Hi, I'm Claire. My sister and I were accepted to the same university, same school, same day, but only one of us got the college fund. And it wasn't me. When I asked why my parents didn't hesitate, she's always shown more promise, they said. So while they celebrated her with dinners and decorations, I took out loans, worked 30 hours a week, and built a business from my dorm room just to prove I belonged. If you've ever had to build your future from the ground up while being told you weren't enough, you're not alone. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because sometimes the people they dismiss end up becoming the ones they can't ignore. And if stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. For most of my childhood, I thought something was wrong with me. From the outside, our home in Salem, Oregon, looked like something out of a Hallmark postcard. White picket fence, trimmed hedges, a small swing set in the backyard that creaked just enough to sound charming. People who drove by probably thought we were a typical middle-class family living the American dream. Inside that house, though, was a silent war I couldn't name until much later. My father, Thomas, was an accountant who wore the same 3 ties in rotation. My mother, Ellen, taught English at the local high school and collected vintage teacups she never let us touch. And then there was Brooke, my younger sister by 2 years, but light years ahead in how my parents viewed her. Brooke had the kind of blonde curls that bounced when she walked. She was charming without trying, quick-witted, and always knew the exact answer to every question in class. She was everything they could show off at dinner parties, everything they thought a daughter should be. And then there was me. I wasn't rebellious. I didn't act out. I didn't fail in school. I just wasn't her. Even when I was 6, I noticed how Christmas morning looked different for each of us. Brooke got the new dolls, the dress-up closet, the shiny things. I got socks. And the quiet explanation from Mom. Your sister needs more encouragement right now. You've always been more independent. At 8, I learned to stop hoping they'd come to my school plays. Brooke had a science fair project that year, a replica of the solar system, with spinning planets that Dad helped her build over 3 nights. I was showcasing my watercolors at the student art night. Mom popped in for 10 minutes between errands. She patted my head, glanced at my paintings, and whispered, "Sweetie, art is lovely, but it's not going to take you far. Focus on something practical." That sentence sat with me longer than it should have. My father said less, but the way he avoided my achievements spoke louder. When I won first place in a district-wide poetry contest, he didn't even look up from his paper. But when Brooke placed 3rd in a spelling bee, he posted about it on Facebook twice. What they didn't understand, and maybe never cared to ask, was how much effort it took for me to be fine. To keep smiling when I knew I'd be forgotten again. To shrink myself so I wouldn't make them uncomfortable with my own needs. There was only one person who saw through the cracks in that family portrait, Grandma Ruth. Every summer she'd invite me to her cottage by the lake. No expectations, no comparisons. Just me, a stack of sketch pads, and her unwavering belief that I was more than enough. "You see the world differently, Claire," she used to say, watching me draw the shifting water under the trees. "Don't let anyone take that from you." Back then, I didn't understand what she meant, but I held on to her words like a lifeline. Because deep down, I think I already knew this wasn't just favoritism. It was erasure. And eventually, I'd have to fight to be seen. There was a stillness at Grandma Ruth's lake house that didn't exist anywhere else in my life. It wasn't just the soft lapping of the water against the wooden dock, or the way the wind rustled through the tall pine trees like a secret being passed along the branches. It was her presence, the quiet, steady kind, the kind that never needed to raise its voice to be felt. Each summer, I spent 2 weeks with her in a weathered blue cottage about 2 hours from Salem. The kitchen always smelled like cinnamon and old books. Her garden was wildly overgrown on purpose, she said. Some things are better when they're allowed to grow on their own terms. I always thought she was talking about her daisies, but maybe she was talking about me. It was the only place I didn't feel like I was competing for space. While Brooke stayed home for tennis camps and piano recitals, I would sit with my knees tucked under me on Grandma's porch swing, sketching the water. She'd bring out lemonade and just sit next to me, not speaking, not judging, just being there. And when I showed her my drawings, she didn't just say, "That's nice." She'd point to how I captured the shadows under the dock or how the ripples in the water seemed to move. "You don't just draw, Claire. You see," she told me once, her voice low reverent. "And people who truly see the world don't always have an easy time fitting into it." I didn't fully grasp what she meant at 10, or even at 15. But those words lived inside me, like a slow-burning truth that would only fully ignite years later. She never asked why my parents didn't come to my art shows, or why they called Brooke during our visits but rarely checked in with me. She just made room for me to exist. Her cottage had a small library tucked into the back of the house, wall-to-wall shelves of biographies, memoirs, and business books. She kept a little notebook with names underlined: women who started companies, men who rose from nothing, people who refused to let circumstance dictate their future. "You should read about them," she said one evening as we sat on the floor of the library summer dusk, pouring through the open windows. "Not because you'll do exactly what they did, but because they remind you that some people carve out space where none was offered." So I read. I read about entrepreneurs who started with nothing but an idea, about women who turned pain into purpose, about resilience not being a trait you're born with, but something you build brick by brutal brick. By the time I was in high school, I had dreams that stretched far beyond Salem. Not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. It wasn't just that I wanted to be successful. I needed to be undeniable. I needed to become someone whose worth couldn't be ignored, someone so capable, so relentless that even my parents would have no choice but to see me. Grandma Ruth never tried to push me in one direction. She just reminded me that I could choose my own. "You're not a side character in someone else's story, Claire," she said during my junior summer. "You're the author, and you get to rewrite what they never imagined for you." Those summers were more than just an escape. They were a quiet revolution. The outside world didn't change when I returned home. Brooke was still the golden child. My parents still forgot to ask about my goals. But something inside me had shifted. I had learned how to trust my own voice, even when theirs drowned it out. And that voice would guide me through every challenge that lay ahead, starting with the decision that would break everything open: applying to Hillcrest University. I didn't know then that choosing that school would ignite the final fracture between me and my parents. But I did know this: I wouldn't let their limitations become mine. By the time I turned 16, I had mastered the art of appearing unbothered. At school, I was the overachiever with color-coded folders and perfect attendance, the girl who stayed behind after business club meetings to help clean up, who volunteered to lead the fundraiser even when no one else wanted the job. On paper, I was doing everything right, but at home, it was as if those pages didn't exist. Brooke, now a year ahead of me thanks to skipping a grade, had just joined the debate team and immediately became its centerpiece. My parents beamed at her every meeting. Dad wore a navy sweater embroidered with the team logo. Mom baked cupcakes for the whole squad. They sat in the front row nodding proudly as Brooke dismantled opposing arguments with sharp confidence. The week after she won her first regional title, they took her out to a seafood restaurant that required reservations a month in advance. When I quietly mentioned that I'd just been named a finalist in a statewide business plan competition, my mother blinked and said, "Oh, that's nice. Be sure to help your sister review her history notes tonight. She's under pressure." It wasn't just forgetfulness, it was erasure. I stopped announcing my achievements after that. Instead, I celebrated in silence, a corner booth at the library with a good sandwich after acing my AP economics exam, or a solo walk around the block the evening I found out my business plan had won first place. No one at home asked how I did. No one cared to know. I started working part-time at a local coffee shop during my junior year. Not because I had to, but because I knew I would. College for me was going to be a solo journey. I sensed it the way animals sense storms before they break, when the sky is still deceptively quiet. Balancing work and school was brutal. I'd get home after 10 p.m. smelling like espresso and burned milk and stay up past midnight reviewing notes. Some mornings I showed up to school so tired that my hands trembled during quizzes. Still, my grades never slipped. I kept my 4.0 GPA like it was my lifeline. Because in many ways it was. There was no safety net waiting for me, Mr. Daniels, my economics teacher, noticed. One afternoon after I stayed late to ask about an extra credit opportunity, he looked at me and said, "Claire, I've taught a lot of sharp students over the years. But what you've done, the discipline, the clarity that's rare." The next day he called my parents personally to tell them how exceptional my work had been. I know because he told me he would. That evening, Mom stirred pasta at the stove, her back to me. "Mr. Daniels called," she said. "Said you're doing well. That's nice." Then she turned around and added without missing a beat, "Don't forget to iron Brooke's shirt for tomorrow's Model UN conference. She's nervous, and your father and I want her to feel supported." Supported. That word sat bitter on my tongue. For years I thought maybe if I just did enough, won enough, worked hard enough, they'd see me. But by senior year, I finally understood it wasn't about effort. It was about what they wanted to see. And they had never been looking in my direction. So I started looking in mine. I spent evenings researching scholarships, building my college list, and drafting essays in the corners of a noisy coffee shop between shifts. While my parents helped Brooke practice mock interviews for early admission programs, I quietly filled out FAFSA forms alone in the dark. I applied to Hillcrest University not because anyone suggested it, but because I believed I belonged there. The business program was one of the best in the country, and something inside me whispered I could thrive there, even if no one said it out loud. The day the acceptance letters came, Brooke got home first. She stormed through the door, letter in hand, practically vibrating with excitement. "I got into Hillcrest Political Science," she shouted. Dad jumped up from the couch. Mom clapped. Someone opened champagne. I stood in the kitchen holding my own envelope in both hands. My letter was the same, different program, same school, same triumph. But no one asked. And when I finally said it quietly, almost too late, Mom turned and smiled faintly. "That's wonderful, Claire. You'll be able to keep an eye on your sister." That was it. That was the recognition. But I didn't cry. Not then. Because by that point I already knew. This wasn't a family that celebrated my wins. It was a family that tolerated them until they got in the way. 2 weeks after the Hillcrest acceptance letters arrived, my parents called a family dinner. That alone was unusual. We rarely ate together anymore. Dad often worked late. Mom claimed she needed quiet evenings to grade papers, and Brooke's schedule was filled with club meetings, debate prep, and weekend competitions. So when Mom texted family dinner, everyone present, I knew something was coming. We sat around the table, the same oak one we'd used since I was 6. The corners were still chipped from when Brooke knocked it over during a tantrum at age 5 and somehow didn't get punished. I could feel that memory in the wood grain beneath my fingers. The meal was quiet, mechanical. We passed food, made small talk about the weather and scholarship deadlines. Then Dad cleared his throat and placed his napkin down deliberately. His voice was steady, rehearsed. "We need to talk about college plans." He said it like we were strategizing a vacation, but his eyes didn't meet mine. They were locked on Brooke. "We've been saving for your education since you were a baby," he said, looking proud. "The tuition at Hillcrest is steep, but we've got you covered. You won't have to worry about loans or part-time jobs. Just focus on your studies." Brooke lit up, radiant with relief. "Really? That's amazing. Thank you." They beamed at her like she'd just cured cancer. And I sat there, waiting. The seconds ticked by, slow and cruel. Finally, I asked, because no one else was going to, "What about me?" The silence that followed felt physical, like the room itself had inhaled and didn't know how to breathe out. Dad's jaw tightened. Mom looked down at her plate, then reached across the table to place her hand over mine, as if a gesture could soften what they were about to say. "Claire," she began gently, "we only have enough saved for one of you." She paused, choosing her next words with the caution of someone hoping to sound fair while delivering something fundamentally unfair. And, well, Brooke has always been more academically focused. We believe investing in her education will yield better long-term returns. Returns. As if my future were a stock not worth betting on. I didn't speak. I didn't move. My mouth had gone dry. "We're not saying you don't deserve to go," Dad added quickly. "Just that Brooke's path has always been clearer. Political science law school, those are tangible. Your business ideas are a bit riskier." I looked at him then. Really looked. He didn't see me. He never had. Mom chimed in again, her tone soft, almost apologetic. "You've always been so independent, Claire. We figured you'd find a way. Maybe take out some loans. Or start at a community college and transfer later. Start at a community college. After 4 years of perfect grades. After winning statewide competitions. After saving every dollar from coffee shop tips and surviving on microwaved soup to avoid being a burden." That was the plan they had for me. "She deserved it, but you didn't." That's what it meant. They didn't say those exact words. They didn't have to. I heard them anyway. That night, I didn't scream. I didn't break plates. I went upstairs, closed my door, and for the first time in years I cried. Not out of self-pity, but from the sharp, bitter sting of confirmation. All along I had thought I just needed to prove myself. That if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, stayed small enough not to ask for too much, they'd eventually see me, choose me. But the choice had already been made. Long ago. Before I ever picked up a pencil or clocked in for a shift. Before I ever knew what it felt like to want something more than air. They had chosen her, and I was the acceptable loss. The next morning I woke up with swollen eyes and an even more swollen resolve. I didn't ask them to reconsider. I didn't beg for fairness. I didn't argue. Because what they withheld from me in that moment said more about them than it did about me. And if they wouldn't invest in my future, then I would, no matter the cost. The morning after that dinner, something inside me calcified. It wasn't anger, not in the way most people imagine it. It was quieter than that. A slow, deliberate closing of one chapter and the firm beginning of another. The kind of resolve that doesn't roar, it hardens. I woke before sunrise, eyes still puffy, the ache behind them dull but persistent. I walked into the kitchen where Mom was stirring her coffee, the steam curling up like a veil between us. She looked up, startled, probably expecting me to avoid them for days, but I stood there steady. "How could you save for Brooke and not even tell me?" I asked, my voice more tired than trembling. She exhaled slowly. "Claire, it's not that we didn't care. We had to make practical decisions. With limited resources, we did what we thought was best. For whom, I asked? For the daughter you understood, or the one you never bothered to?" Dad appeared then, newspaper in hand, inserting himself like he always did when emotions threatened to go too far. "You've always had distractions," he said flatly. "Working part-time, those side projects. Your sister's always had one focus, school. It made sense. It made sense. That was their defense. It made sense to bet everything on the daughter who sparkled, and nothing on the one who fought silently every day to be seen." I didn't argue. I didn't ask for help. I simply said, "Thank you for the clarity," and I walked out. That weekend I drove 2 hours north to the only place that had ever felt like mine, Grandma Ruth's cottage. She didn't ask why I showed up unannounced. She didn't need to. When I finally told her everything, every word of that dinner, every ounce of what it meant, she reached across the kitchen table and held my hand like she was anchoring me to the earth. "My darling girl," she whispered, her eyes glassy but sharp with conviction. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the last to see us clearly. But that doesn't mean you're invisible. It just means their vision is limited." I bit my lip to keep from crying again. She squeezed my hand. Promise me something. You'll go to Hillcrest anyway. You'll show them not out of spite, but because your path matters. Because you matter. I nodded even before I knew how I'd do it, even before I had numbers or plans, because in that moment, the only thing louder than my pain was her belief in me. The next morning I began. I spent hours on the Hillcrest website combing through every line of scholarship and grant information. I created a spreadsheet with deadlines, eligibility, and required documents. I scheduled a meeting with Ms. Patel, my high school guidance counselor, who stayed late after school for the next 3 weeks, helping me fill out every form draft, every essay. "You're one of the most focused students I've ever worked with," she said one afternoon as we printed my 20th application. "And I've worked with many. I applied for federal loans, private ones, grants for first-generation students, aid for students who had worked part-time, scholarships for young entrepreneurs, female leaders, academic excellence, financial need. You name it, I applied. Piece by piece, I built a fragile bridge across the void my parents had left. By May, I'd secured 3 small scholarships. They didn't cover everything, but they proved something to me. People outside my family were willing to invest in my future. With Grandma Ruth co-signing, I was able to finalize a combination of federal and private loans to fund my first year. Not comfortably, but enough. Next came housing. Brooke would live in the premium on-campus dorms, complete with weekly laundry service and catered meal plans. I found a listing for a small, aging apartment 45 minutes from campus, shared with 3 strangers with unreliable plumbing and questionable insulation, but it was within budget. Barely. I accepted it. And then I began job hunting. By some small miracle, I landed a position at a cafe just off campus, early morning shifts before class. 2 weeks later, I picked up weekend hours at a used bookstore. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't ideal. But it was mine. As move-in day approached, I packed everything I owned into secondhand suitcases. My mother, in an oddly stilted moment, offered me a set of old twin bed sheets. No apology, no reconsideration, just sheets. On the morning of the move, my parents drove Brooke in our family SUV, loaded with new bedding, electronics, and coordinated decor. They had hired movers to assist. I followed behind in my 10-year-old Honda that needed a new radiator and stalled when I stopped too fast. At the entrance to campus, Mom waved through the window. "Good luck, Claire," she said lightly. "I hope this all works out." And I remember thinking, it won't just work out. It'll become something they never saw coming, because I wasn't here to survive. I was here to rise. The first night in my new apartment, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared. I was far beyond that. Fear had been replaced by something colder, weightier. A sense that the next 4 years weren't just about education. They were about endurance. The room was barely bigger than a closet. The paint peeled near the windows. The mattress was thin enough that I could feel the slats of the frame beneath my back. My roommates were strangers, kind enough, but noisy. Through the walls, I could hear one of them arguing on the phone, another blasting music. I stared at the ceiling, calculating how many hours I'd need to work each week to cover rent, groceries, and the loan payments that would eventually come due. A number formed in my head. 30. Maybe more. Could I survive on 5 hours of sleep? Could I study between shifts? Could I build a life in the cracks of my schedule? Just as the spiral of doubt started tightening around my throat, my phone lit up. A message from Grandma Ruth. "Remember, my brave girl, diamonds are made under pressure. You're already shining." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. But I read those words over and over until my heart stopped racing. The next morning, I made a schedule. Hour by hour. Color-coded. Brutal. Classes from 8 to 2. Cafe shifts from 4 to 9. Homework from 10 to 1 a.m. The bookstore shifts on weekends. No buffer, no breaks, no safety net. But it gave me control. And for the first time in months, control felt like hope. The first few weeks were punishing. I burned my hand on the espresso machine. I fell asleep during a lecture and jolted awake to find the professor staring at me with pity. My feet ached. My bank balance hovered near zero. I rationed groceries, rice, canned beans, and peanut butter. Some nights dinner was just tea and toast. But I showed up. Every day. And slowly, something shifted. In my Introduction to Business course, I found myself answering questions no one else could. Concepts like risk management and cost efficiency weren't abstract ideas to me, they were my life. I understood what it meant to make strategic trade-offs to stretch limited resources to build systems that held under pressure. While my classmates spoke in hypotheticals, I spoke in survival. One afternoon, Dr. Chambers, my professor, called me aside. "Claire, your case study analysis on small business pivot strategies was extraordinary. Have you ever considered research work?" I stared at her, caught off guard. "Research?" I asked. She smiled. "You already live what most of these students are only starting to understand. That kind of insight is rare. Rare." That word echoed in my chest like a balm and a bruise at once. Around that time, someone else noticed me too. Zoe, one of my roommates. She was studying sociology, the type of person who remembered birthdays and left handwritten notes on the fridge. One night, after I came home from work too tired to eat, I found a container of homemade soup in the fridge with my name on it. I stood there staring at it, unsure whether to feel gratitude or guilt. She appeared behind me, arms crossed. "You're not going to pass out in this apartment from starvation," she said, not unkindly. "Eat, then sleep. We'll talk later." From that night on, Zoe became my family. She cooked. I edited her papers. She made flashcards. I helped her with stats. When I broke down in the bathroom at 2 a.m. because I couldn't afford a textbook, she bought me a used copy and said it was a housewarming gift. I hadn't known that kind of care could come from someone who didn't share your blood. "My parents always said family is who shows up," she told me one night. "Looks like yours didn't. But I will." And she did. Together we built a rhythm, a tiny ecosystem of mutual survival. She defended my study time from noisy roommates, and I did the same for her when midterms hit. Some nights we stayed up late drinking tea and whispering about what life could look like after all this. And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something I'd have to crawl toward alone. Yes, I was still exhausted, still broke, still navigating a system that wasn't built for girls like me. Girls without a net, without a cheer squad, without a name that opened doors. But I had two things that changed everything: a mind shaped by necessity, and a heart strengthened by those who chose to believe in me. By the middle of my sophomore year, I thought I had found a balance. It wasn't graceful, but it worked 30 hours of work per week, a full load of business classes, barely enough sleep, and a few precious moments of silence between shifts to breathe, to read, to write. I had made a science of survival. Every dollar was tracked. Every class was strategic. Every assignment was an opportunity, until the bottom dropped out. The cafe, my main job, the one that paid most of my rent, cut everyone's hours in half due to seasonal slowdown. Just like that, 40% of my income vanished. I remember staring at the revised schedule posted near the espresso bar. My name next to 6 HR's week. My hands went cold. My first thought wasn't even panic. It was a calculation. I had 2 weeks before rent was due. I biked back to my apartment that night in the rain, teeth clenched, legs, burning fury swelling in my chest. Not at the cafe, not even at the economy, but at how fragile everything still was. How one shift in the system could snap everything I had held together with thread and grit. When I got home, I sat on the kitchen floor back against the fridge and let the weight of it hit me. Zoe found me there 30 minutes later, my soaked hair plastered to my neck, my fingers clenched around a calculator. "You're not failing," she said before I could speak. "You're adjusting." And that's when I remembered Ms. Langston from the financial aid office. She'd told me months ago, "Come see me before things feel impossible." So the next morning I did. After reviewing my situation and seeing my academic record, she looked at me solemnly. "You've earned more than sympathy, Claire. You've earned help." She offered me an emergency grant, small, but enough to buy me a month of breathing room. Then she mentioned something else. "Dr. Chambers recommended you for a research assistant position in the business department. It pays better than your current job, and it could open doors." It opened more than door. The research project focused on small business resilience, how local shops and startups survived economic downturns. I worked under Dr. Chambers, compiling case studies, analyzing patterns, and without realizing it, absorbing models of innovation born from scarcity. It felt like I was reading my own story in every data set. Businesses started from nothing, scraping by, pivoting, stretching pennies into survival. "You have a unique lens," Dr. Chambers said one afternoon. "Have you ever thought of launching something yourself?" That question didn't leave me. Late one night, while studying data about microenterprises, I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed, "What do small businesses actually need?" The answer overwhelmingly was time, administrative help, organization, online presence, things they couldn't afford to hire full-time staff for, but desperately needed. That's when it clicked. I knew how to schedule. I knew how to write copy. I knew design basics, email marketing, spreadsheets, task management, and client communication. I had been running my own life like a lean startup for years. So I built a website, just a simple landing page. I offered virtual assistant services, social media help, invoice tracking, calendar management, and customer emails. Everything I had done for myself, I offered to overwhelmed business owners for a reasonable rate. I sent my first cold emails at 2 a.m. that Sunday. By Friday, I had 2 clients. By the next month, I had 5. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't stable yet, but it gave me something I had never had before: leverage. I quit the bookstore job, kept the research position for the mentorship, worked nights on client tasks, weekends on marketing, and filled the space between with homework and scholarship deadlines. My agency didn't have a name yet, but it had legs. And more importantly, it had me. A girl who had spent her entire life being told what she wasn't. Now finally creating something that said exactly what she was: resourceful, strategic, relentless. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. By junior year, things started to look different. Not easier, but different. My small agency was bringing in enough income to replace the unstable shifts and scrape together side jobs I'd once depended on. I'd hired 2 part-time student associates from my marketing class, both hardworking, both balancing school and survival like I was. They weren't just employees, they were co-builders. I kept my research assistant position not for the paycheck, but because working with Dr. Chambers still felt like standing beside a window that opened to everything I could become. And for the first time, I wasn't operating in total invisibility. My name showed up on academic honor boards. Professors started quoting my work in lectures. I was invited to co-present a case study at a regional business conference, and I still remember the moment Dean Walters stopped me afterward and said, "Your perspective doesn't just reflect grit, Claire. It reflects vision." For a girl who'd spent most of her life being measured in silence, it was disorienting to be seen, to be spoken about with respect. But perhaps the most unexpected shift happened far closer to home. Brooke. We had maintained a civil but distant relationship on campus. She'd text occasionally, invited me to sorority events, which I always politely declined. Our worlds were orbiting the same sun, but never quite intersecting. Until one cold Tuesday night in November, I opened my apartment door to find her standing there, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a laptop and a folder of papers. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quietly. She was failing her senior thesis seminar. Apparently, her professor had shredded her methodology, warned her she had 3 weeks to rework everything, or she wouldn't graduate on time. She looked at me not with superiority, not with defensiveness, but with something almost foreign on her face: humility. That night we sat side by side on my tiny couch surrounded by coffee mugs and highlighters. I pulled up example frameworks, walked her through proper academic research methods, and helped restructure her outline. At first it felt mechanical, transactional even, but as the hours turned into nights, something softened. Brooke began asking questions. Real ones. "How do you manage all this?" she asked one evening, pointing at my spreadsheet of clients' classes and deadlines. So I told her. About the cafe, the bookstore, the twin sheets Mom gave me while she packed Brooke's monogrammed bedding, the sleepless nights, the skipped meals, the loan papers Grandma Ruth had co-signed without hesitation. Brooke sat there frozen. "I had no idea. I believed her. They always said you were doing fine," she whispered. "Like you just didn't want to come home. I didn't realize it was survival." I didn't say, "You never asked," because for the first time she was listening. And in that fragile honesty, something began to heal. She started turning down the expensive gifts our parents sent, said she didn't want them if Claire didn't get them too. She showed up to one of my class presentations and cheered louder than anyone. She called Grandma Ruth to thank her for seeing things we all missed. Our study sessions became check-ins, then inside jokes, then sisterhood not built on shared childhood but on mutual choice. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And maybe that's all healing really is. Not a return to what was but a reconstruction of what could be. Meanwhile, the university was noticing too. Dean Walters called me into her office in early February. I expected another scholarship form or a department task. Instead, she looked me in the eye and said, "Claire, we'd like you to consider delivering the student address at graduation. Your journey here. It represents exactly what this institution hopes to stand for." For a moment, I said nothing. Just tried to remember how it felt sitting at that dinner table 2 years ago, hearing I wasn't worth investing in. And now I was being asked to speak for the entire class. I accepted. Not because I needed to prove something anymore, but because I had something worth saying. Graduation arrived like a slow drumbeat, distant at first, then suddenly deafening. Every milestone felt surreal. Final presentations, last staff meetings, the final check-in with Dr. Chambers, where she hugged me and whispered, "You've already done more than most people twice your age." But nothing felt as overwhelming as the night before the ceremony. Grandma Ruth had just arrived in town, and after dinner she pulled a slim white box from her bag and placed it in my hands. "This was mine," she said simply. Inside was a graduation stole, soft ivory, embroidered with a phrase I knew by heart: "Diamonds are made under pressure." She fastened it around my neck with the same tenderness she used to wrap my scarf when I was little. "Wear this," she said. "Not to remind them who you are, but to remind yourself in case they still don't see it." That night I barely slept. At 6 a.m., Zoe knocked on my door, grinning. "Your chariot awaits, boss lady," she said, motioning toward her car. "No buses today. You ride like the CEO you are." The campus buzzed with excitement, caps and gowns everywhere. Proud families snapping photos in front of buildings I used to cry outside of after night shifts. I found Brooke near the robbing area. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. "You look like someone who's about to change the world," she whispered, adjusting my cap. "We both made it," I replied, and this time I meant it. As graduates were led to their seats, the auditorium swelled with applause. I scanned the crowd and spotted my parents front row, dressed impeccably, expressions tight with anticipation. They hadn't acknowledged my speech. I hadn't told them. Let it be a surprise. The ceremony unfolded in expected rhythms, honors, conferrals, calls for purpose and promise. Then President Harlow stepped to the podium. "Before we conclude," he said, "we have a few special recognitions. First, please welcome Claire Morgan of the School of Business, this year's selected student speaker." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. I rose, walked to the stage, and saw the exact moment my parents realized what was happening. Shock bloomed across their faces. I stepped to the microphone and breathed in once deeply. "My name is Claire Morgan. And I arrived at Hillcrest not with a safety net, but with a spreadsheet, a student loan, and the fierce belief that education isn't something handed to you, it's something you claim inch by inch. I didn't speak with bitterness. I spoke with clarity. I talked about working 30 hours a week while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, about starting a business from my dorm room, about watching others be handed support while building my future in the shadows. I talked about resilience, not the glossy kind in inspirational posters, but the kind you forge alone in library basements at 2 a.m., whispering to yourself, just one more hour. And I ended with this. The greatest lesson Hillcrest taught me wasn't in a textbook. It was that success built without recognition is still success. And sometimes being underestimated is the best advantage of all, because it gives you the hunger to prove not just to them, but to yourself who you really are. As I stepped back, the applause started small. Then it grew, and then it roared. President Harlow returned to the mic, smiling. Thank you, Ms. Morgan. And now a few additional announcements. He looked down at his notes, then up at the crowd. I am proud to share that Claire Morgan graduates today as valedictorian of the School of Business with a perfect 4.0 and national honors in entrepreneurial innovation. A sharp intake of breath from the audience, and from the front row, stillness. But perhaps most inspiring, he continued, is that Ms. Morgan achieved all this while entirely self-financing her education. No family contributions, no safety net, just drive strategy and heart, gasps, whispers. Applause that turned into a standing ovation. From the stage, I looked at my parents. They were frozen, color draining, image cracking. Everyone around them was clapping for the girl they thought would never amount to much. The girl they left to figure it out alone. And now she was being celebrated by the university, the faculty, the crowd. By everyone but them. And in that moment I realized something. Their silence no longer had power. Because my story no longer belonged to their version of me. It belonged to me. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out into sunlight and celebration. Laughter bouquets, cameras snapping non-stop. Families wrapped their graduates in hugs and praise in a warmth I had learned to live without. I walked with Grandma Ruth on one arm, Brooke on the other. Zoe found us a few minutes later, breathless with excitement, and wrapped me in a hug that nearly lifted me off the ground. That speech, she whispered. You shattered the ceiling, Claire. Every single word. We made our way to the business school reception, an elegant gathering arranged by Dr. Chambers and Dean Walters. Crisp linen tables, congratulatory banners, and champagne flutes catching the afternoon light. This wasn't just a reception, it was a coronation. Faculty members, peers, industry, guests. They all came up to shake my hand, to ask about my business, my future, to say, I read your case study, or I sent your speech to my daughter. At some point, Dean Walters approached with a woman in a sleek navy suit. Claire, this is Jennifer Ellis from Stratwell & Co. She saw your pitch at the national competition. The woman extended her hand, firm and direct. We were impressed. Your approach to small business scalability was both innovative and deeply human. We'd be honored to have you on board. I blinked, then smiled. Thank you. I'd be honored to join. Her grip tightened just slightly. Smart answer. Zoe's eyes widened as Jennifer walked away. Stratwell, Claire. That's one of the top firms in the country. I know, I said softly. And I belong there. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. Meanwhile, across town, my parents were hosting a graduation dinner at the rental house they'd booked for the weekend. I hadn't been invited, at least not meaningfully. The message had read, We assume you'll be busy, but feel free to come if you're free. Conditional, passive, familiar. Still. Grandma Ruth tilted her head as we drove past it on our way home. Sometimes, she said, showing up isn't about acceptance. It's about being seen for who you are, even if it makes them uncomfortable. So I went. The front door swung open and conversations faltered. Relatives turned to look at me, some surprised, others unsure. My father approached first. His tone was forced casual. "Well, this was quite a surprise," he said. "That speech. You've been holding out on us, huh?" I smiled, calm and even. "I've never held anything back. You just weren't listening." Brooke stood beside me, arms crossed. "Everyone's talking about Claire's business, Dad. About the scholarship, the consulting offer." "Did you even know she'd been self-funding this whole time?" Mom tried to interrupt. "Claire's always been independent. Independent by necessity." Grandma Ruth cut in sharply. "Not by choice." The words hung in the air like cracked glass. Then Uncle Drew, one of the quieter relatives, cleared his throat. "Robert, Ellen, did none of this come up at the last family dinner? You always talk about Brooke's achievements." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't want to make Claire uncomfortable." "No," I said gently. "You didn't want to be confronted with the truth that the daughter you overlooked built something without you. And now you don't know where to put me in your story." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was clarifying. We sat down to dinner, and the dynamic had shifted. For the first time, questions came to me. About my company, my plans, my life. With each answer, I saw my parents' faces falter because the reality was undeniable now. Their story had cracks. After dessert, my father cleared his throat again. "Your mother and we'd like to offer some help. For a deposit, maybe. On your new apartment." I looked at him carefully. "Thank you," I said. "But that won't be necessary. Stratwell's starting salary includes a signing bonus, and my business is stable." He blinked. "You've done well." I nodded. "Yes. And I didn't do it for your approval. I did it because I knew I could, even when you didn't." Brooke squeezed my hand under the table. Mom looked down at her plate. Grandma Ruth. She just smiled. That quiet, knowing smile she'd worn every summer when I brought her sketches of a world I was learning how to survive. As we walked to the door, Brooke turned to me. "I'm staying at Grandma's for a few days. You should come. Just us. Just the people who saw you from the beginning." I smiled. "I'd love that." And as we stepped outside into the cool night air, leaving behind the people who had underestimated me for so long, I realized something that struck deeper than anything said that evening. Their recognition had come too late to matter, because I had already recognized myself. The Monday after graduation, I unlocked the door to my new apartment with a kind of quiet ceremony. It was nothing extravagant, one-bedroom, second floor, with a view of a brick wall and a laundromat sign that flickered at night. But it was mine. Paid for by a combination of scholarship winnings, business revenue, and my new signing bonus from Stratwell & Co. I stood in the middle of the empty space, the floor still smelling faintly of fresh paint, and let silence wrap around me like a welcome. No leftover resentment in the air, no echoes of being compared, no question of who I needed to be to earn love here. This was the first place I'd ever lived that wasn't a survival strategy. It was a choice. Over the next few weeks, life began to take shape in ways I hadn't expected. Stratwell was demanding, but in a way that excited me. Strategy meetings, client pitches, working alongside people who spoke the same language of ideas and execution that I had taught myself in the quiet corners of underestimation. I wasn't the resourceful underdog here. I was a professional, a peer. Meanwhile, my agency continued to operate now, fully managed by a team of students from Hillcrest I had trained before graduation. They texted me updates, invoices, and progress snapshots like proud apprentices. And I realized something. The business wasn't just a source of income anymore. It was a pipeline, a ladder I had built, and was now holding steady for others. At night, I often found myself sitting on the balcony with Zoe, who'd moved into the apartment next door. She said she just couldn't deal with strangers after the chaos of undergrad and asked if I'd mind living in neighboring units. "Are you kidding?" I laughed. "I was about to ask you the same thing." We shared late dinners, traded stories about our new jobs, and took turns watering the plant she insisted we name Resilience. It somehow thrived even when we forgot to feed it. Fitting. But the most grounding presence remained Grandma Ruth. She visited once a month, always arriving with something homemade, a lemon tart, a pot of stew, a stack of old business journals with post-it notes tagging the best articles. One afternoon she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet etched with a single word, enough. This was my grandmother's, she said softly. She gave it to me when I graduated, told me, a woman's worth doesn't increase with applause. It simply is. And now I'm giving it to you. She fastened it around my wrist. It fit perfectly, like it had always been waiting for me. And then there was Brooke. True to her word, she stayed close. Not out of guilt, but out of a new kind of sisterhood. We had weekly dinners sometimes at Grandma's lake house, sometimes in my apartment, where she helped me build furniture from scratch and laughed when we put the legs on backward. She'd chosen a career in nonprofit education, something that surprised no one more than herself. I think I needed to believe I had earned everything on my own, she told me once. But watching you, I realized how much I'd been carried. We never spoke much about the past directly, not yet. But every kind gesture, every moment she showed up, felt like a wordless apology that meant more than any sentence ever could. My parents remained polite. They sent me a congratulatory email when the business magazine published a feature titled, "The Girl They Underestimated: How Claire Morgan Built a Six-Figure Agency from a Dorm Room." It included a photo of me, Grandma Ruth, and Brooke at graduation. No parents in the frame. It was never about exclusion. It was about truth. Because the people in that photo weren't just proud of me, they were part of me. Zoe, Grandma, Brooke, Dr. Chambers, Ms. Langston, Ms. Patel. They weren't assigned to me by blood. They had shown up, stayed believed, and in doing so became something sacred, my chosen family. 1 year after graduation, I returned to Hillcrest. Not as a student, not even as a guest, but as a sponsor. The day was crisp golden with early fall, the kind of light that makes even the shadows feel gentle. I stood in the business school atrium, the same space where I once snuck in granola bars between classes and handed a signed agreement to Dean Walters. The Claire Morgan First Generation Achievement Scholarship was officially established. It wasn't based solely on GPA, not just on accolades or polished resumes. It was designed for the student. I used to be the one quietly working 25 hours a week, navigating forms alone, eating toast for dinner, and daring to believe their potential mattered, even when no one around them said so. I want the selection committee, I said, to look not just at where the student is, but what they've overcome to get there. The first recipient was a young woman named Tasha, a sophomore studying accounting, raising 2 younger siblings while juggling school and a part-time warehouse job. When I met her, she didn't thank me. She just said, "You're the reason I didn't give up this semester." And that was more than enough. My parents attended the scholarship announcement. They stood in the back, quieter than usual. No grand speeches, no claims of shared success, just presence. After the ceremony, my father approached me more tentative than I'd ever seen him. "You've created something. Real," he said. Mom added, "You've become someone who turns pain into purpose. That's rare. And beautiful." I nodded. "Thank you," I replied. "But I didn't become that. I always was. You just didn't recognize it." There was no malice in my voice, only truth. Because by then I had learned something most people spend decades trying to understand. Their failure to see my worth didn't mean I didn't have any. It only meant they lacked the eyes to see it. Forgiveness, I'd realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about releasing the expectation that the past could have been different. As I walked to my car later that afternoon, I received a message from Grandma Ruth. It was a photo of her on the cottage porch, holding the Visionary Leaders magazine with my article on the cover. Her message read simply, "I knew. Before the world knew. and I'm still watching you shine. I sat there for a moment, the setting sun pouring gold across the windshield, and I let myself feel it all, the grief, the grit, the grace. Because this journey was never just about proving them wrong. It was about discovering that I was never broken, just underestimated. And sometimes that's the greatest gift of all. Because once you stop waiting to be chosen, you start choosing yourself. And from there, you become unstoppable. Thank you for listening. If this story made you think of your own quiet victories, the ones no one clapped for, tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. And if you'd like more stories,